Our next speaker is Ignacio Saiz, and Ignacio is Executive Director of the Centre for Economic and Social Rights, an international NGO which works for the recognition and enforcement of these rights worldwide. CESR has brought the voice of human rights to the struggle against unfair austerity measures in the wake of the global economic crisis. Earlier this year, CESR published Mauled by the Celtic Tiger, a human rights analysis of the economic crisis in Ireland and its impact on people. And Ignacio will speak to the human rights impact of austerity and how international human rights law and its mechanisms are trying to grapple with austerity and the impact and the need to incorporate human rights into responses to the crisis. So moving directly on now to looking at what are the solutions that human rights helps to offer to the current crisis. Ignacio.
I want to start by thanking Colm, Ros and Nolan and all the colleagues at Amnesty Ireland for hosting this event, which I think is the culmination of, I would say, years of thinking within the section around how to make sense of human rights in the sphere of economic policy and how to grapple with the implications, the human rights implications of the crisis. As an ex-Amnesty staffer myself, I am familiar with the work of the movement in this whole area. I want to stress how pioneering Amnesty Ireland's work has been, and to congratulate you on this event and to encourage you to deepen and strengthen the work even further. I think what I have to say will be complementary to what Iain has just presented. Rather than meeting the tall order that Colm set in terms of what are the solutions, I think we need to grapple towards those solutions collectively together. I'm going to share the experiences of the Centre for Economic and Social Rights as an organization, a human rights organization, struggling, perhaps devoting more of its time than Amnesty, perhaps, because of our mandate to work on economic, social and cultural rights specifically. How the journey we have undertaken over the last few years since the crisis took hold. And I'm going to structure my presentation in three sections. Firstly, how from the beginning we tried to make rights relevant, the three dimensions that I'll discuss of the economic crisis, the financial and economic crisis that we try to grapple with through a human rights lens. Then I'll spend a few moments talking about our work in Ireland that Colm mentioned, and in Spain, because I want to draw out some commonalities and some lessons learnt at the end, based on that experience of working on austerity measures and their impact on human rights in two critical contexts in Europe. Actually, let me just go back to that. The CSR first started working on the crisis in late 2008, I would say, or late 2008, early 2009, as the impacts of the near collapse of the financial system began to make themselves felt in the real economy. CSR is an organization which exists to address the emerging threats to ESC rights worldwide. We knew that the effects of economic recession, massive unemployment, the collapse of the housing market in the US and Europe would be potentially devastating, not just in those countries, but also worldwide in terms of their knock-on impacts. Compounding what was already a crisis in many parts of the world as a result of the food and energy crisis. It's important to note when we talk about the crisis beginning in 2007, that's a very European perspective. Most parts of the world have been in crisis perpetually, even in Eastern Europe, I would say. And so it's important that we were feeling the impacts of a crisis that in other parts of the world simply provided an additional layer onto an already critical situation. Also, as an NGO that has its base in the US and in Madrid at the time, we soon saw those feared effects, the concerns that we were worried about. We saw them materialize both in deteriorating indicators of poverty and economic, social, and cultural rights enjoyment in our countries, but also in the increasing stories of hardship and suffering faced by individuals, families, and communities around us who were bearing the brunt of the crisis. Now, our first reaction then was to search for a simple framework for analysis, a way of structuring and advancing the argument that human rights were relevant to the crisis. And so our early work looked at the human rights implications of the crisis through a three-part lens of causes, consequences, and responses. It's nothing too sophisticated or elaborate, but simply we felt that human rights the human rights framework that Iain so eloquently outlined needed to apply itself to each of these dimensions. Human rights, we argued, have something to say about the causes of the financial and economic crisis, as Iain alluded to. Now, even though the causes of the crisis are complex to analyze and still the subject of much controversy, there's broad consensus that certain factors played a critical role. The biased and inadequate financial regulation of the financial sector, the complicity of many governments in the inflation of the housing bubble, long-standing patterns of increasing socioeconomic inequality worldwide, which have been shown to have created conditions in which which facilitated the financial collapse, and also commodity price speculation in the case of the food crisis. I mean, all of these issues require much more unpacking, but these are commonly believed to have been some of the causes of the crisis, which can and should be analysed from the perspective that Iain described. Particularly the perspective of the obligation of states to protect human rights by regulating and constraining potentially harmful acts by private actors. And also to honour obligations under the right to adequate and affordable housing. That's another lens through which the causes of the crisis can also be looked at. Now, at a time when the crisis was being presented as if it was a natural disaster, a malfunction of the market which no one could have predicted and no one could have controlled, we felt it was important to stress that the crisis was the result of deliberate actions or omissions by states and others for which governments, as duty bearers under international human rights law, should be held accountable. In terms of consequences, and Iain has already summarized in a global sense what some of those have been, so I won't repeat that, we at CSR sought to highlight which rights were at stake. And in a nutshell, I would say all rights are at stake, including civil and political rights. It was very important also to show that the indivisibility of all rights manifests itself in the context of the crisis, where you had social protests against the crisis being repressed in a very brutal fashion in many countries and parts of the world. Increases in violence against women, many ramifications that really need to be taken on board. So a holistic take. We are the Centre for Economic and Social Rights, but we needed to take a holistic take on the range of rights that were at stake. And also our analysis also tried to focus on a global level on which groups were particularly affected. And again, it's invidious to say some groups are more affected by others, but it's important also to take the lens of discrimination when looking at the impacts on women, children, migrants, the elderly, etc. So in terms of responses, we were interested to look at how obviously primarily how states has responded, and we initiated a kind of quick and dirty survey. CSR is part of an international network, which some of you may know, the International Network on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, ESCR Net. And through our membership of that network, which has hundreds of organizations working at the national level, we coordinated a kind of survey to say, tell us how your government is responding to the crisis. Tell us what the main impacts are for you and what the main patterns are in response. And so we pulled together a piece, this was with other organizations too, trying to see to what extent human rights had been brought to bear in policy responses. And needless to say, human rights had barely figured certainly in the deliberative processes in many countries. I'll say a bit more about that later. But we also wanted to look at how international bodies had responded, because we felt this was an issue that really called into question the effectiveness of global governance in our time. So we also did a fairly quick and dirty. We do a lot of quick and dirty. We did no, we don't. We do excellent, rigorous analysis. but timeliness was an issue here. So we wanted to get a kind of snapshot of how UN bodies had responded. And there we saw, you saw kind of a peak in attention around late 2009. The UN Human Rights Council had a special session, had a couple of special sessions on the human rights impacts of the crisis. There was a Stiglitz Commission, one of many Stiglitz commissions, which had great language. We stand at on the verge of a transformative moment when the world's problems are going to be resolved. Human rights has to be there at the heart. And then from 2009, you just see a waning of that interest, a waning of the commitment by international bodies to globally coordinate responses. And that's extremely significant too. But thirdly, in terms of responses, we wanted to look at the responses of civil society organizations, our own responses. How effectively were we as civil society actors using human rights instruments in a relevant fashion to combat the injustices that we were seeing around us? And by civil society, I would include there the social movements that we saw emerging in many countries, particularly in CSR's office. We couldn't ignore what was going on in the street. You probably would have heard of the 15th the 15th of May movement in Spain. We were challenged there. It was our own version of Occupy, but we got there first. We were challenged to see how human rights could be made relevant to that struggle, to that energy. How does that relate to our human rights analysis? Okay, I think I need to move on a bit more swiftly. So why did we look at Ireland? We felt that by 2010, the crisis was playing out very differently in different parts of the world, and that there was definitely a trend that could be seen, particularly in Western Europe, well, in Europe as a whole, I would say, and to some extent in the US, a trend towards austerity measures, away from what's been called fiscal expansionary measures, which had been basically followed in the first few years in the US. Certainly in Europe, there was establishment of this kind of orthodoxy around austerism, as we call it. It works better in Spanish, austerismo, and an unhealthy obsession with austerity. So we needed to contextualize the analysis, and that's why we focused in on Ireland. Why Ireland? Well, just chronologically, it was one of the most salient events around 2009, 2010. The sheer suddenness of the collapse, the dramatic nature of it, the potential impacts. Also, though, we were influenced by two other things. Ireland's appearance before the UPR, where this came just at the tail end of that process. We made a submission to the UPR process, but we were also interested to see how the government's commitment, which I'm not sure what it is word for word, but more or less they said, well, we're committed to upholding human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, even despite our financial constraints. We wanted to hold the state to that commitment and to see to what extent that commitment played out in the budgets that were approved in 2011 and other social policy measures. And also we were heartened, and I have to stress this again, we were heartened by the fact that people in Ireland, many people in Ireland, civil society organizations, were also asking the same question: how can human rights be made relevant? We were heartened by conversations with Ros, by the work of FLAG, by others here in this room. As an organization not based in Ireland, we felt that an analysis of what was happening here would be useful. So very briefly, because this is all in the MALD report, MALD by the Celtic Tiger, which I gather Ros has made available. In terms of the causes of the crisis, this is all more familiar to you than me. We looked at how a very lax regulatory regime, the origins of the housing boom, reckless lending and borrowing on the foreign markets, exceptionally low tax rates, particularly corporate taxation. I mean, Ireland just stands out as having one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the whole of Europe. And a serious problem, as in many European states, of tax evasion. I'll mention the significance of the tax issue a bit later. But these were all part of the poisonous cocktail that meant that contributed to the causes of the crisis in Ireland. And the graphic, I'm not sure if it's very clear, but just shows Ireland is the green line at the bottom. It's government revenue as a percentage of GDP, just to show that in comparison to other countries, the tax take is extremely low in comparison, and that basically starves the public coffers of funds. In terms of consequences, again, I'll rush through this. You know it better than I. You've lived this reality more than I have. Soaring unemployment, rise in poverty, particularly child poverty, previous gains in terms of the decrease in poverty levels being reversed. Inequality, social inequality, income inequality widening, a deterioration across a range of health and education indicators, etc., the problems that you're all familiar with in terms of housing. And in terms of analysing who is bearing the brunt, well, no surprise, it's lone parents, women, children, older people, migrants, travellers, people with disabilities. And in terms of the responses to the crisis in Ireland, we looked critically. I mean, the whole point of the report is really to look at austerity budgets, and how the policy responses of the Irish state measured up to the obligations that Iain mentioned. And what you see in the National Recovery Plan is a disproportionate emphasis on spending cuts, including social spending cuts, in comparison to an emphasis on revenue generation, on progressive tax reforms. And bearing in mind Ireland's very low tax take, that's all the more surprising. You know, that the revenue almost was not given the same degree of emphasis. The cuts, the 10 billion euros worth of cuts in the National Recovery Plan affected key areas of social spending, including health and education. There were social security benefits that were slashed just for the people who were bearing the brunt of the crisis in the first place. Again, there is more detail in the report. What I want to stress, though, is that we felt that there were, in analysing the situation in Ireland, that the avenues for accountability were sorely lacking. You know, Iain ended his presentation on the issue of accountability, which is surely what human rights brings, in one word, what human rights brings to this kind of situation. The non-incorporation of the covenant into domestic law, or the not fully incorporated into domestic law, the traditional judicial resistance, I think, to seeing ESC rights as justiciable in Ireland, were key, blocked basically key avenues that might otherwise have been available. Human rights bodies were undermined themselves as a result of budget cuts, the sort of forced mergers and disappearances of the Combat Poverty Agency, I think, which was effectively dismantled. And then you had, in such a situation, one turns to the Constitution, where the fundamental values of a nation are enshrined, and there you have a very weak enshrining of ESC rights as a value, mere guiding principles or directive principles. But instead, what you have in this context is enshrining a balanced budget as a value that trumps all others. And I'm talking here about the constitutionalization of the deficit cap, which we also went through in Spain. So how can that be that the Constitution is turned to enshrine that value, but is not invoked to protect people's fundamental rights and human dignity? I should also mention the accountability of actors beyond borders, particularly salient in the Irish case because of the terms of the bailout. There are actors here, the European Central Bank, the EU, the IMF, who have human rights responsibilities themselves. And again, a human rights analysis needs to look at what is called in the lingo extraterritorial obligations, or the obligations of states acting as part of international institutions. And this has to be part of the picture. Another element of that accountability piece, the lack of accountability, is also the limited possibility of civil society participation or citizen participation in deliberations around how to respond to the crisis. I mean, you can say better than I can, but our impression from CSR is that there was zero possibility, or very limited possibility, to influence or shape the National Recovery Plan or any other measures taken in the wake of the crisis. We made roughly 10 recommendations, which are in the report. I just want to pick out a couple of them. Iain, they chime, I think, with some of Amnesty's recommendations. We made perhaps some more detailed recommendations about what an impact assessment should look like. There are basically two kinds. You can assess impact of a policy after the fact, or you can assess impact as a policy is being considered. We actually called for, given the moment that we published this in, an ex post and after the fact assessment of the austerity measures undertaken at the end of 2011, invoking the very human rights principles that Iain mentioned and explaining in a way how they could serve as the framework for that assessment. And then saying that the results of that should act as a kind of baseline for future assessments that were done before the fact, if you see what I mean, for future ex-ante assessments of future policy decisions. I can explain further. We also seized on the recommendation in the UPR that Ireland set up a national action plan on human rights, and Ireland's commitment, the government's commitment to do that, to say you need to incorporate these issues here. For reasons of time, I'm just going to perhaps highlight we made strong recommendations, specific recommendations about what progressive tax reform would look like. We said, raising VAT is probably the worst thing you can do as your sole revenue generating measure, because VAT generally, by and large, depending on how it's implemented, is seen as more regressive in the sense that it hits the poorer people disproportionately rather than income taxes. And some of the other recommendations there, I think, speak for themselves. We also made noises about financial regulation and how a couple of processes that were going through at the time, including the setting up of the new Irish Fiscal Advisory Council, and how that body should see its role as itself as having a human rights role. I mean, probably they would look at you bemused if you said that, but surely if we're talking about lack of financial regulation having been one of the causes of the crisis and a human rights problem, then surely that's the kind of recommendation we need to be making. Okay, moving swiftly on, because I'm nearly done. Spain. Why did we work on Spain? Because we were there and we heard the clamour from outside our office window, and also because we had a golden opportunity to press for accountability. Very similar circumstances in Spain to Ireland, very similar, including the causes of the crisis in Spain. The particularly harsh impacts are also to do with the collapse of the construction industry, and very similar in similar circumstances to Ireland's. The opportunity that we seized was that Spain was appearing before the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in May of last year. And so there had been very little possibility for getting the government of the two governments at the time basically to really respond to the people around the justification for austerity measures. And so that absence of accountability made us, CSR, and 20 other groups with whom we formed a coalition, seek recourse to Geneva. In other words, with Geneva, which is where the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights is based, in the hope that if we could get strong recommendations from a treaty body on Spain, they would listen to the treaty body, even if they're not listening to us. So, lack of accountability nationally can spur the recourse to international mechanisms. And I said Geneva versus Brussels because in Spanish, covenant, the International Covenant on ESC rights, the word is pacto, pact. So it's the same word as the fiscal pact. So the only pacto that the government was really interested in listening to was the Brussels diktat of fiscal probity, the fiscal stability pact. And so we were saying there's another pact, there's another pacto that you have obligations under, and it's not Brussels that you need to account to, it's Geneva, and by Geneva we mean accountability to your own citizens, not like accountability to a bunch of human rights experts in Geneva, but accountability to your own citizens. So that was what spurred a more statistical-based analysis of the impacts of the crisis and austerity measures in Spain. I'll flick through these because, again, we have a fact sheet, a Spain fact sheet that's on our website. I don't think we have copies here, but it's on our website. So just some examples of what kind of statistical analysis we brought to the committee's attention. This slightly nerdy diagram, all the diagrams are a bit nerdy, but they speak to valuable human rights points. This shows how discrimination is often a compound, has compound effects. People don't exist in identity silos. They are women and they're migrants and they're disabled, etc., etc. And this shows how when you disaggregate the poverty hazard rate, which is already very high at the average level, 19%. Look at the at risk of poverty rate of women over 65. much, much higher than the average. So basically, poverty has a female face in Spain, and it has an elderly and a young face. Yeah, so it's children, youth, and elderly people. And for many reasons, the elderly are amongst the most vulnerable in Spain. We also put the spotlight on inequality, on social inequality. Inequality generally is not sufficiently addressed by the human rights movement as an issue of as a flag that there may be discriminatory policies underpinning inequality. And we were shocked when we did an analysis of how income inequality has evolved. Spain is the red one, so you can see income inequality shooting up, no coincidence, from the onset of the economic crisis, whereas the EU 15 and EU 27 average more or less stays the same. Now, we wanted to use the Spain example, as well as just bringing horrible facts to the committee's attention, we also wanted to nudge the committee, the treaty body, into making stronger analysis of the principle of non-retrogression, the principle that you cannot backslide in human rights without justificatory cause. Yeah, but we wanted to. The non-retrogression argument has to be made in a subtle way. Not every deterioration, not every decline in, say, poverty rates, or sorry, not decline, increase in poverty rates or decline in ESC rights enjoyment is per se retrogression. You need to look at what the state has done or not done to respond to, or that may have contributed to that decline. Do you see what I mean? It's not just a decline in outcomes. You need to look at the policy efforts and the resources that have been put behind that. And so CSR's analysis was to try and look in Spain, and here these graphs relate to housing, to look at how deteriorating housing outcomes might be to do with bad policies, flawed policies, and inequitable resourcing. I can explain more. This is what we call the OPERA framework: outcomes, policy efforts, and resources. And these graphs basically show on the left-hand side, these are household. This is a comparison of Spain against other countries in Europe. Households with a heavy financial burden. So Spain has one of the highest. The highest is Italy, in fact. And then the second graphic, which is a bit blurry, I'm sorry, is shows Spain as having a very small proportion of social housing stock. This is a big issue, I think, in Ireland too. But that's an example of how you look at an outcome, and you look at the policies that should be contributing or mitigating those outcomes, and there's something wrong. And then when you look at the resources in Spain's austerity budget of 2011, apologies for the blurriness, this describes areas of spending, particularly social spending, which decreased in the 2011 budget. You see there's one area that did increase, which, fair enough, pensions, slightly by one. That was the one on the left. Now the third, I can't even read it here, the third to the right is housing. So given everything that we'd analyzed in terms of the terrible housing situation, the budget for housing was slashed by more than other areas of social spending. So these kind of correlations, triangulations of outcomes and policies and resources lead you to make a more powerful argument that the state is in violation of its obligation of non-retrogression. Yeah? Rather than just saying there's a bad indicator, you need to look at the whole picture. And in terms of policy alternatives, I'm nearly done. In the Spain context, as in the Ireland context, we put a lot of emphasis on tax. Now, tax is a human rights issue, and tax is an issue that the human rights movement and those working with it really need to grapple with. And in the development sphere, people have been dealing with tax and equity issues for many years now. It's not as controversial as it may sound, even though it can be difficult to analyze. What this graphic shows is how this question of the fiscal equation, you can't just look at cutting expenditure, you also need to look at raising revenue in a fair and equitable way. And this compares, the inner circle is what was saved, if you like, through the austerity budget cuts of 2011 to 2012, so 27.3 billion euros, yeah, the small red circle in the middle. But then the outer circle, then the next one out, is the potential estimated revenue that you would have gained if you had combated tax evasion, not completely, but by a small percentage, by what is considered by tax experts a reasonable percentage that can be clamped down on in terms of tax evasion. So that's already more, 38 billion euros. The total revenue lost to tax evasion is the white kind of circle there, 88 billion. And then the total public deficit is the very outer circle. So the point that this graphic is trying to make is that, you know, clamping down on tax evasion, even in a small way, and it's a huge problem in Spain, could have contributed more effectively than some of these drastic budget cuts. So again, the question, this is relevant to retrogression. A retrogressive measure, cuts to social spending, may be justified if they are the least harmful way of proceeding, if there is no alternative, if they are necessary and proportionate. There are certain limits to what governments can do in terms of retrogressive measures. This suggests that there were policy alternatives that have simply not been explored because they're not expedient. And I just want to finish by plugging the issue of tax. This shows the relevance of taxation. Look at the two countries. Let me explain this graphic. It's the link between low tax countries that have low tax bases have high inequality. That's basically what this graph shows. There's a strong correlation indicated by that diagonal line that on the left-hand side, the Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality. Yeah. And on the bottom, total government revenue as a percentage of GDP basically describes the amount of tax take. What are the two countries that stand at the top left-hand corner? In other words, high inequality, low tax take. Spain and Ireland. This is a very, I mean, this isn't conclusive, but this is a very suggestive indication that the issue of tax is directly correlated with the issue of social inequality and needs to be addressed not just to plug the fiscal deficit, but also as a corrective measure to widening inequalities in both our countries. And I will end simply with 4 lessons and ways forward. It is possible to distill and explain and apply human rights principles, the framework of human rights principles that Iain described, to the causes of the crisis, the consequences of the crisis, and to responses. And I think one of the challenges that we have, as Iain said, is to clarify what we mean by those concepts, to push authoritative bodies like the Committee on ESC Rights to also help us in clarifying some of the more nebulous concepts. There's a lot of fuzziness around the concept of retrogression, for example. And I want to stress that it is important for human rights people to address causes as well as consequences if we want to address the structural roots of the crisis. Otherwise, we're just, and I've seen this in much analysis, in well-meaning human rights analysis, it zooms in on the consequences. But that means you're talking about the symptoms. But what about the causes? You cannot forget the cause dimension. I think we need to be bolder in challenging the orthodoxies around austerity. It's still a hegemonic debate. It's a debate that's largely unchallenged, and that's because human rights people are weak, have a weak voice in the policy circles where these things are debated. And yeah, okay. But in doing so, in challenging policy orthodoxies, an organization like Amnesty might be reticent to do so because it's a sort of new area of policy. But there's a lot out there written by and analyzed by very authoritative, very not scary UN agencies, for example, like UNDESA, UNCTAD, others, UNRIST. These are UN agencies that have consistently challenged the orthodoxies of austerity. And I think an organization like Amnesty that is very careful about its sources, as are we, can rely on these authoritative bodies, which are bodies of the UN themselves, in challenging some of this. Pursuing effective avenues of accountability is critical, and I think this will run through as a discussion in the rest of the day. We've begun a mapping of litigation initiatives worldwide in the context of austerity. Who is bringing cases? What kinds of cases are being brought through which instances, including constitutional court cases. We've already seen some in Latvia, in Hungary, in Portugal. Positive constitutional court cases. There have been some negative ones. And also through other courts. To what extent are human rights principles being invoked by ordinary citizens and those who work with them to challenge some of the austerity measures? And we're also looking at NHRIs and working with NHRIs to see how national human rights institutions can skill themselves up to monitor the impacts of the crisis on ESC rights in particular. At the international level, there are many mechanisms that can be used more effectively. The treaty bodies, there are some special rapporteurs, UN special rapporteurs that have done great work in this area, including the special rapporteur on extreme poverty who visited Ireland. Some of us here in this room had a meeting with the Human Rights Commissioner of the Council of Europe, who has expressed a very strong and genuine desire to address the impacts of austerity measures, and so on and so forth. And Iain mentioned the European Social Charter as a key instrument that needs to be invoked at the European level. And finally, and I'm sorry for taking so long, I think the human rights movement should also, if it wants to be effective in this work, as well as skilling up and grappling with all the conceptual and practical difficulties that we talked about earlier, I think it also needs to link to other channels of activism and advocacy. My point earlier about tapping into what's going on in the street and what Occupy movements, and not just those, but trade unions. The trade unions are at the forefront, at least in Spain. I don't know here. In Spain, they're at the forefront of raising the banner of rights and of social rights, and yet they haven't been close partners, the unions and human rights activists. And I think it's important for human rights to tap into that more mobilizing language that other movements have been more successful, I think, in invoking. Perhaps it's to do with the terminology we use. Going out into the street with a banner saying progressive realization according to maximum available resources now is not the most mobilizing of so tapping into the visceral sense of injustice that many ordinary people feel, certainly in Spain, and I'm sure here in Ireland too. So to finish, I would say that this is certainly not a time for human rights to go into recession. As Iain said, ESC rights really should come to the fore in this context. And I think in a sense, there's a missed opportunity. The crisis was an opportunity, but it's an unfulfilled opportunity for the human rights movement to really place these rights and all human rights at the fore. I think we have to rise to that challenge of making economic and social rights in particular an effective instrument for protecting human dignity in times of economic and social crisis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ignacio. And could somebody just go out and cancel those progressive realization now badges that we ordered yesterday? Oops. Yeah, thank you. I think this morning's session really opens up for us this day. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot recently, how do we begin to answer some of the challenges that are presented very often by governments, by policymakers and by legislators and indeed by civil servants as to why economic, social, cultural rights cannot be provided for in law? Why can't they be justiciable? And of course, the big argument has always been, well, separation of powers. You cannot enshrine in your constitution something that in any way suggests that the courts will begin to limit or define government's income and expenditure decision making. But we've just done that. We've just enshrined in our constitution a cap on deficits. We've just, for the first time ever, written into the constitution a clear law that says this is the limits of what government can do with money. But what we haven't placed on anyway into our constitution is, well, what should that money be used for, and what are we meant to achieve, and to what end do we collect and spend money in the first place? And we know that one of our big problems in Ireland is very, very poor systems. We have very fragmented systems of decision making. We've got very fragmented systems of service delivery as well. So hopefully we'll begin to see ways in which a human rights approach can begin to inform some of that.